Welcome to the Susan Brender Show. It's all about you. Featuring shows on health and wellness, the performing arts, politics, and people who inspire you to be your very best. And now, here's Susan Brender.
I'm Susan Brender, and this is the Susan Brender Show. Today my guest is Mark A. Calde. He published his fourth original novel called Bascomville, a sprawling romantic family drama about first love and the dark secrets that families keep hidden behind closed doors. Now, I'm going to let Mark tell a little bit about his story, so let's start with that. Mark, from the point of view of the young Max Bascom, whose eyes his father is with contempt and his mother with pity, the novel takes the reader on an insightful, absorbing, and compelling journey. So, if that's the case, tell us a little bit more.
Well, first of all, let's talk for a moment about the title of the book. Max, the main character, his last name is Bascom, and one of the points I'm making in the book is that in spite of all that's going on around us in the world every day, and it gets more complex, it seems, every time we wake up in the morning, what we are most concerned with and where our center exists is within our own personal world. So Max Bascom lives in Bascomville, and you live in Brenderville, and I live in Caldeville. And our worlds sometimes, hopefully often, coexist with other worlds, and sometimes they bump up against other worlds, and friction, and sometimes violence results. But in spite of all that, we always return to our centers, our own personal universe.
Now, you mentioned something about our world being a difficult place. I agree with that. There's no, I mean, who can debate that? Now, for you, what makes it a really difficult place to live in?
Well, for me, what makes it difficult on an ongoing basis is to look around and see the harm that we do to one another. Not necessarily physical harm. That's certainly terrible and bad enough on its own. But the day-to-day way we treat one another, the slights we inflict upon one another, the lack of respect we show to one another, and especially in terms of love. My book is subtitled A Story of Love, which is very different from a love story. A love story is simply two people falling in love with one another. This is a story of what it means to be in love and what love is and the responsibilities that go along with that.
Mark, what is love?
Love is a mutual tightrope that, in terms of romantic love, the two people are walking together, and it's a kind of balancing act between being true to yourself and becoming part of the other person in the relationship, and this works both ways, without absorbing that other person and without falling into the trap of trying to make that other person your own.
Now, I'm going to read a quote from you. Okay. And you say, Bascomville looks at the responsibility men have in romantic relationships and explores the idea that everyone's world really only exists within their own four walls. That's such an interesting statement. Now, you also go on to talk about Max falling in love with the girl next door. Now, what's the percentage of people that happens to?
Probably pretty small, and that's one of the great things about being a novelist. You get to play God to a certain extent, and you get to arrange, or should I say rearrange, the world a little bit here and there as to the way you might like it to be. I mean, wouldn't it be rather joyful to suddenly wake up one day and realize that the girl or the boy next door to you, whom you've just been friends with since you were children, is suddenly a person that you love and want to spend the rest of your life with. So it was a happy thing to do.
Well, that's a wonderful thing to introduce there's so many horrible things going on in the world that when people read about romantic things and love and all of that, they're just, it takes them, it distracts them from the horrible things that are going all around. Now, one of the other things is that I wonder what you think about now that the computer has all these dating sites, like Match.com,
right,
and on and on. Would this be something that you think would be good for our society today, or is there's something wrong with that?
On the whole, I think it's dangerous, only to the extent that, we'll take something like Tinder, for example, which is immensely popular, and you swipe the photo right or you swipe the photo left, and it engenders a kind of very irresponsible, almost disposable attitude towards people of the opposite sex. I mean, men do it to women, women do it to men.
Mm-hmm.
And granted, if all you're looking for is recreational sex, then I suppose it's as good a clearinghouse as anything else. But that's what it really comes down to. It's a clearinghouse, and the people involved in it are more often than not, I think, at least from my perspective, viewed as simply objects in a warehouse. You're walking up and down the aisles, and you'll say, well, I'll have one of those and two of those, and no, that one doesn't appeal to me. And it's essentially dehumanizing.
Yeah, that's what most people say about it, but that's the reality. It's the reality of our times. So if you could change it, how would you?
If I could change it, I would, and that's one of the things I'm trying to do with Bascomville, is to show people that, especially from a man's point of view, that when you fall into love with someone, you have to try to shed this cultural imperative that the man has to be the rock all the time, that the man can never show his vulnerability, that the man has to be the ultimate fixer of all problems, and that the woman exists mainly to be taken under the man's wing and sheltered. And I think that's a very poor and dangerous fallacy. Men have to be able to show their vulnerability. Men have to be able to admit that perhaps the woman they're in love with is a lot smarter than they are, at least in some ways, if not in every way. And men are very, very reticent and, I think, afraid to do that.
Why do you think they're afraid? I mean, because what do they have to lose? Exactly my point, and I'm so glad that you get it. They have nothing to lose and everything to gain, and I think they're afraid because they've grown up with this warped impression that's largely societally imposed of what it takes to be a man. Men aren't supposed to cry. Men are supposed to be steadfast and all these other kinds of things. I mean, it goes back to the days when they went out with a club and club dinner and dragged it back to the cave. Right. Oh, well, I don't think anybody would want to live in that kind of society. I mean, now, let's talk a little bit more about Max. Even though he's a fictional character, Max, he kind of is the epitome of a lot of the guys that live in our time, isn't he?
Well, he is, in the sense that he's out there, he's found this girl, and he's trying to, at least gradually comes to admit that she does know best, and she is kind of his guide out of the wilderness, so to speak. But at the same time, when they meet their challenges, or at least are faced with their challenges, he can revert back to being afraid and to getting angry and to striking out. And I mean, my feeling is that each and every one of us, every day, to one extent or another, have to work it out. And by it, I mean life.
Right.
And sometimes Max does that pretty well, and sometimes he makes an unholy mess of it, and as do we all.
Yeah.
And in that respect, he is very much the modern man.
Yeah, he's the modern man. Wow, the modern man. Now, interestingly enough, you also talk about Ayn Rand and Paulo Coelho.
Mm-hmm.
Now,
yes.
why? What's so significant about them?
Well, those are two books that, on the surface, The Fountainhead by Ayn Rand and The Alchemist by Coelho, that couldn't be on the surface farther apart. But really, they both speak to the same essential truth, which is that we, each of us, have to go out there. Coelho puts it in terms of fulfilling our personal legend, and Anne puts it in terms of selfishness, but not the typical version of selfishness. And they're both extremely inspiring books. I'm on my probably fourth or fifth time through The Fountainhead right now. I reread it every few years.
And The Fountainhead had a lot of romance and love.
It had a great deal of romance, but a very atypical romance. Dominique and Howard Rourke, to the casual observer, hate each other's guts, but and she tries to destroy him. But when you get into it, you realize what her motivation is and what his motivation is, and they are deeply, deeply in love.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Now, with regard to what's going on again, like how many people, 50, 60% get divorced?
Oh yeah, I mean, I'm in California, and I think unfortunately we may lead the country in that.
Yeah.
I think 2 out of 3 marriages fail in California.
What do you attribute to that?
I attribute to that the fact that people have a unrealistic expectation that love is going to solve all their problems without any effort on their part.
Mm-hmm.
And when the road gets bumpy, as it inevitably will, and not just once, but sometimes many, many times along the way, and they're not willing to put in the effort to meet the other party halfway and to say, what's wrong? Is it my fault? Or let's not worry about whose fault it is. Let's try to make this right again. Mm-hmm. When that doesn't happen all by itself, they give up, and that's a shame. Mm-hmm. Also, I think there's a certain cultural prodding that says, well, I'm X number of years old now. It's time to get married. Mm-hmm. So let's go do this. Oh well, I'll try the dating service, or I'll do whatever. And gee, he's handsome and she's good looking or beautiful, and so all our friends say we make a nice couple. So I guess maybe we should get married. Well, I mean, good heavens, that's not the best foundation.
Yeah. Now, how does it affect? I mean, you, after researching and after doing this book, when you think about how many people are no longer reading books, I mean, maybe they read a lot of books online, but the hardcover or the softcover isn't as popular. So how does it affect you?
It affects me in the sense that my book is now available as a digital download as well as a paperback. And if I hadn't done that, I would be slamming the door at an awful lot of people who might well enjoy this book and might gain some insight from it. So it's a fact of life. You just have to do that. Personally, I mean, I'm 70 years old, so mm-hmm. I'm an old-fashioned guy when it comes to books. I like to hold a book in my hand, mm-hmm. But I also own a Kindle. So and I read on the Kindle.
Right.
But,
go ahead, Mark. I'm sorry. No, you go on.
But to ignore the digital aspect of publishing, I think, is a fatal mistake. And I'm not sure it's bad or good. I think it simply exists.
Right. Now, you've written this book about love, and there are so many other subjects that you probably would like to write. Now, can you give our audience an understanding of what you think your next book will be?
Well, right now I am working on a sequel to Bascomville, and because Max is only 21 when the book ends, and Janice is essentially the same age, so and it does end on something of a note of indecision, expectation, whatever you'd like to call it, a cliffhanger, I suppose.
Yeah.
And I'm also making notes on a young adult series. I like to bounce around a lot when I write. I don't like to pigeonhole myself. I've done suspense. I've done historical fiction. I've done international action intrigue. I've written novelizations of screenplays. So I'm kind of, I guess, what you call, if you want to use a sports metaphor, I'm kind of a utility player.
That's a great word, utility player, about an author. You mentioned teenagers, young people. It's very important, as far as I'm concerned, to get people to read. You know, let me tell you a little story. I had an uncle. Unfortunately, he's no longer with us. But my uncle said to me on various occasions, he said, "Listen, Susan, if you really want to learn how to write, the best thing to do is to read the whole New York Times and make notes." Now, I thought that was a great thing.
It's a great piece of advice.
Yes, wonderful. So if you were to give advice to people about wanting to write when they know, and they know how difficult it is, you know, to get your book published or self-published even, what would you say to them?
Well, I would say first and foremost, like anything you want to do, you have to commit to it. You have to throw yourself into it, which is not to say you have to do it 24/7. But if you want to write, sit down and write. Find an idea that strikes the spark in you, even if it's just for a 20-page short story, or if you're nonfiction, something that you have to research and put down on paper. The most important thing is to do it. I mean, I sound like an athletics shoe commercial, but
no.
But just get out there and do it, and be prepared to be discouraged and learn from your mistakes and learn from your disappointments. If you want to be a writer, you'll find out soon enough, because you can't hide from it.
Right.
Sooner or later, you have to come back and write.
I hear you. Now, that said, when young people they learn to write, do you think it's something that's going to help them get a job, that it's going to do a lot for them?
I think so, very much. I think one of the single most important tools to navigate through life is the ability to communicate clearly and effectively. Yeah. And if you can take the thoughts that exist in your head and put them down on paper in a clear fashion, then you get used to doing that, then you'll be able to articulate those thoughts verbally in a job interview or in the middle of the workplace when a problem arises.
Now, have any of your books been picked up by Hollywood, if you will?
My first novel, Shadow Boxer, which was a suspense novel, was actually optioned for a television movie of the week. It didn't happen, but it was, and that book had a nice little ride. It was translated into a couple of German editions and was hardcover and paperback and some other international sales. But no, nothing I have written has actually made it to the screen. And living in Los Angeles, you know, that's hard to divorce yourself from the film community. But so whenever you write a book, you know, people will say, "Oh, who do you see playing the main characters?" And I used to get involved in that game, and now I don't anymore. If somebody wants to make it into a movie, that's great. If they don't, the book still exists.
Yeah. Okay. Now, let's talk about Hollywood for a minute. Okay. Do you feel? I mean, you must see a lot of movies. I do.
Yeah.
I think it's the greatest thing. Now, of all the movies that you've seen in this very short time, which movie kind of turns you on, if you will?
Well, my all-time favorite film goes back quite a ways, but my all-time favorite film is Lawrence of Arabia, because of the amazing portrait of this very, very complex man, and also because they just don't have the time or energy to make 4-hour-long movies anymore.
Yeah, right.
The most recent film I saw is a quiet little film. It's Woody Allen's new film, Cafe Society, and I loved it. I thought it was a very, very good look at 30s Hollywood, and it was terrific. He remains I think he's 80 years old now. He remains an extremely insightful observer of life.
Yeah. Ooh, an observer of life. That's a great statement. Now, how do you define that for you?
For me, as a writer, in general, and as a novelist in particular, observing life is just the first step. I then have to try to filter that through my artistic lens and use it to say something instructive and hopefully insightful, which I try to do in my book Bascomville, rather than just tell the story of connecting the dots from A to Z. So to me, observing life is all about getting inside of what I see going on around me.
You just want to give us one thing that you see around you that you feel is important for you to tell our audience?
I see a lot of people, and I touch on this in the book and one of the themes, I see an awful lot of people over the years, this keeps recurring, struggling to become quote-unquote normal and to homogenize and even out their existence. And my experience is that we each make our own normal. There is no test tube for normalcy. We all have our share of lunacy. We have to learn to embrace that. We all have our serious sides. We have to learn to embrace that. What's normal for you may be completely abnormal for me, and vice versa. And at the end of the day, so what?
Yeah, exactly. So what's normal for you, Mark? Is there something you want to tell our audience about with regard to that?
Well, with regard to that and love in general, I mean, I've been married 47 years now, so I have a bit of a track record with the ups and downs. And as I say in my book, ultimately the one thing I would like everybody to keep in mind is that with love, there is always a way. There is always a solution. There is always a tool that you can pick up and use to meet whatever challenge is facing you.
That's a great way to finish our show. So Mark Calde is an author of a book called Bascomville. Now, if people want to buy your book, if they want to get in touch with you or talk a little bit about the book, how do they do that?
They can go on my website, Bascomville.com. They can communicate there. They can purchase the book in hardcover, digital download there. It's just emerging from the womb right now, and a little bit down the road it will also be available on Amazon and on a website called The Prose, Prose, which is a website devoted to all forms of the written word.
That's great. Well, I always like to give my guests the last word. Is there something that you want to tell our audience?
Well, I would like to tell them not to give up on love, not to give up on themselves, and to look deeper into one another.
Well, thank you, Mark Calde, for being on the Susan Brender Show. It sure was an education for our audience and certainly for me. Thank you again.
Well, thank you very much. It was a pleasure talking with you.
My pleasure, too.
Thank you for listening to the Susan Brender Show. To be a guest, email sebrender at yahoo.com.